This is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about the American presidency, a little bit of its history. I wanted to talk about some of the people who were presidents. Now, of course, we have had 43 individuals who were president, not 44, although we are on the 44th president. I find it rather fascinating that our present president mentioned at his inauguration speech that he was the 44th individual to take the oath of office. Well, of course he was not. He was the 43rd. But I'll forgive him for that. Nonetheless, an interesting thing to think of with the American presidency, it was designed, and it's a very unique thing that was basically created during the Constitutional Convention. There was a lot of argument over it. There was a lot of comment about it. There was a lot of fear of it. There was some suggestions that there should be more than one president. It should be like a regency where you'd have, several people bouncing off of each other who would rule. The one thing they wanted to get away from was any form of a king or any kind of a dictator. Now, of course, with time and the changes that took place over time, you start to have issues that have changed a lot in the American presidency. But let's start from the very, very beginning, which in that famous song from The King and I, let's start from the very, very beginning, a very good place to start, right? So, George Washington is our first president under the present Constitution. Now, you have to remember, we had other people that were president before under the Articles of Confederation. But the Articles of Confederation, well, basically was a disaster and was replaced by the present Constitution. And George Washington would take the oath of office on April the 30th, 1789, in New York City, which was the capital of the United States. Now, there's things to mention about Washington. He was the first. So we have to give him a great deal of slack. We have to give him a great deal of credit. We have to give him a great deal of understanding. And the thing about Washington was that he was walking on uncharted territory. And this is a scary thing when you're starting with a new republic. He understood the fact that everything that he did would be scrutinized. And he realized that everything that he did would create a precedent. So he was very cautious, and in many cases, very much a reaction president rather than a proactive president. There's wisdom to this. Now, George Washington was not the brightest bulb in the world, and he knew it. But he had the common sense to understand that the best thing to do when you are not on an even playing board with some of these brilliant ones around him is just shut up and don't say anything. Hence, the thing is, everyone talks about the wisdom of George Washington because he said very little. Pretty smart, actually. But George Washington set up the American presidency. Of course, the presidency that he kind of created was somewhat regal. He kind of based it on a monarchy. It is a little frightening when you think that when he became president, he would ride in his carriage pulled by white horses, and his slaves dressed in livery would walk outside of the carriage, very much like a monarch. Washington did not shake hands. He would bow. He would have levees where Martha would, get to know people, and he would meet people. He was cautious with foreign affairs and was extremely strong on getting involved with foreign entanglements. His farewell address, which was mainly written by Hamilton, partially by James Madison, and the rest was by Washington himself, who added his own taste to the speech. It's interesting to note that a historian by the name of Jared Sparks, who did the first biography in the sense of using all the papers of Washington, which were given to him to work with by Bushrod Washington, who had been a Supreme Court Justice, and also from Marshall, the Chief Justice. And whenever he found something that he disagreed with or found that was not really Washington, he would destroy it. And Washington's farewell address, which we realize was by Hamilton, he cut up into little pieces for autograph collectors. Only about half of it has been found. The other half is unfortunately lost. But it was due to historians like that that destroyed much of the reputation of Washington. I will say also that Washington was changed over time by historians, or I should say people who thought they were historians, creating a character that was nothing but fiction. Parson Weems, for instance. We realize that silly nonsense of the cherry tree. That was made up by Parson Weems. Other things we don't really realize that Parson Weems also developed, and that was the piety of Washington praying at Valley Forge. Washington never did that. That was purely a fabrication by Parson Weems. But as a president, he set up the beginnings of the American presidency. And considering the pressures that were on him, considering what he had to do, I think he did a very good job. I think he kept the government very small, very controlled, very quiet to a degree. And when he did hand over the reins peacefully to John Adams, when he becomes president in 1797, Adams has a peaceful turnover and a government in good working order. Now, John Adams' presidency, I feel sorry for John Adams. John Adams is one of the most brilliant individuals who ever had anything to do with American history. He was the atlas of American independence. He was the fellow that went to the Netherlands during the American Revolution to get money so we could finance the war. He was dealing with the British. He signed the peace terms with the British. He was in France meeting with various individuals, working with Franklin, sometimes fighting with Franklin. He did so much for this country. And he became the second president. I don't care who the person was. There was no one who could satisfactorily follow George Washington. George Washington is in a class all himself. I don't have to say that. I don't think anyone can argue that fact. He was looked upon as a god in the pantheon of gods of our country. George isn't the very top. And so John Adams had to fill shoes that were things that he could not. And the two-party system, which started to rear its ugly head during Washington's administration, really festered and got damn ugly during Adams' administration. I will say this, that John Adams did one of the most heroic things of any president. He sacrificed himself for his country. Now you may say, what did he do? Well, you have to remember that we had an issue with France. And going back to George Washington, when we had the issue with the English and the French causing problems with us, when it came to the English and the French, of course, Washington sent representatives over. John Adams created the Navy. John Adams sent diplomats. That's where we have the XYZ affair. And then we started having a undeclared war, to a degree, with France. It was mainly a sea war. And John Adams, after having the problem with the XYZ affair, did not give up. Alexander Hamilton, who was brilliant at times, but other times, obviously, was a cup and saucer short of a full play setting, wanted to have a war with France. He was chomping at the bit for war. Adams said, have a war with what? We had no major navy. We had no major army. Going against another world power? Are you insane? It's more or less what he said to Hamilton. And Adams, through diplomatic means, finally ended our problem with France, worked out deals, and through his efforts saved the United States from going to war, and also created an atmosphere in which the Louisiana Purchase could become a reality. I think one of our greatest presidents was John Adams. He's very underrated. He did some incredible things, and he did some really stupid things. The Alien and Sedition Act was pure insanity. Well, at the time it made sense, but politically it was disastrous and would basically be the final nail in the coffin to finish off the Federalist Party, which would linger for another 10, 15, 20 years, but it was basically DOA by the time Adams runs for re-election. I think that's enough for the first two of our presidents. Obviously, I can see I'm going to be talking a lot on a number of them. But I thought it would be interesting just to talk about the American presidency, because we talk a little bit of it, but I wanted to throw a few things that I don't see mentioned as often as they should. Thank you.